Kelly, you're up. So we're going to jump. Kelly Mulvey is a Ph.D. at North Carolina State University, understanding and addressing bias-based bullying among children. So maybe some of this also kind of feeds into what Glenn was talking about when we have all students coming back and, you know, they've not been around each other. And so Kelly, thank you so much for joining us, taking time out of your busy day to give us your expertise. Again, we will take questions, you know, throughout, and then we'll do a little Q&A. But thank you so much. I want to hand the microphone and the screen over to you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I am so glad to be here. At the moment, I can't share my screen. So I'm waiting to see. At the moment, it says it's disabled for me. If someone who can do the tech work can allow me to share my screen, that would be awesome. All right, now we're moving. Give me just a sec to get it up. And then to also gotta move my little green bar out of the way. Okay, so thank you so much for that brief introduction. I am Kelly Lynn Mulvey from NC State, and I want to speak with you today about bullying in general, but also specifically bias-based bullying, which is growing in frequency and has some different outcomes than traditional bullying might. So I'm hoping today to provide you with a little bit of the data that we have from our lab that explains what bias-based bullying is, that identifies what strategies we can use in schools, and then I'm also going to touch just a tiny little bit on what parents might do as well. I kept most of the focus on schools, but I do recognize that we might have a diverse audience here in terms of their roles with children. So first, I wanted to tell you a little bit about me. So I did my undergraduate work at Duke University and my master's in teaching at Duke University. And then I was a public high school teacher at Durham School of the Arts, which is a 6 through 12 magnet school. And working at Durham School of the Arts is really what got me interested in thinking about intergroup contact and opportunities for kids to interact with each other when they may not share the same background or identity. Because at DSA, we found that even though our kids were from all over the city and from very different socioeconomic, gender, race, ethnicity, religious backgrounds, they had these common identities around their arts focus. So our visual arts students, our theater arts students, our writing students, and that helped to break down some of the barriers that they might have faced in other dimensions of their life if they weren't as similar in terms of some of those other identities. After working at DSA, I got more and more interested in kids' experiences that brought them together and also that pushed them apart. I was interested in social exclusion and bullying in particular, and I decided to leave the classroom and head to the College of Education at the University of Maryland to do my PhD. I settled on the University of Maryland for my work because my mentor there had been building a strong reputation around focusing on kids' experiences in the classroom around social exclusion and bullying, and it was exactly what I wanted to do. After finishing up there, I headed to the University of South Carolina, where I was an assistant professor in the College of Ed for about 4 years. And then I came here to NC State. Now I'm over in the psychology department, but I still put all of my focus on kids in schools, and all of my data collection occurs in schools and partnerships with districts. So starting out, I want to give you a little bit of definitions. So first of all, this is probably going to be familiar to most of you, but I just want to make sure we're talking the same language when we're thinking about what bullying is. So broadly, we are thinking about aggressive behavior. We want to define it as being intentional. So sometimes kids engage in aggressive behavior that's accidental, and bullying is intentional aggressive behavior. It also is repeated, so it occurs over time again and again, and there involves a power dynamic. So the bully is in some way asserting power, either real or perceived, over that victim. Bullying can take many different forms. We often think about physical bullying first, so things like hitting, kicking, punching, spitting, tripping or pushing, or taking or breaking someone's things. We can also put making mean or rude hand gestures into physical bullying. However, this is not the only type of bullying. So verbal aggression is quite frequent as well. This would involve things like teasing, name calling, inappropriate sexual comments, taunting, threatening to cause harm, and it can occur either in person or increasingly online as well. Similarly, social bullying involves leaving someone out on purpose, telling others not to be friends with someone, spreading rumors about someone, embarrassing someone, and this one can also occur either in person or online. So how often does bullying really happen? This is such a tricky question because the statistics look really different depending on the study that you're examining. We can say with confidence, though, that it's happening more than you would expect. So each day, and this data is about 10 years old, so I'm hoping to get some newer stats on this, but each day, about 10 years ago, more than 160,000 students in the US chose not to go to school because of fears related to bullying. You heard Glenn speak about the fact that sometimes the decisions that kids make in schools are because of fear related to going to school. So bringing that weapon in because they're trying to protect themselves. This is kids who are so fearful that they choose not to even attend school that day. It's a concerning number. Moreover, generally we see about 20% of youth report being bullied, but the reports range hugely, everything from around 10% all the way up to about 90% of youth reporting that they've experienced bullying. Moreover, it's often the case that school personnel don't observe bullying when it happens. So it's covert. It happens in places that teachers aren't. So in the hallways, before school, on the bus, on the playground. And because kids are often trying to conceal it, then school personnel are often not aware that it's happening. So I also want to talk briefly about the impact of bullying. So we know that bullying affects victims. Kids who experience bullying report higher depression, greater anxiety, more physical illness, and they report lower academic achievement and lower school participation. Definitely concerning. We also find that they tend to graduate from school at lower rates than those who don't report bullying. Bullying also affects the bully. So kids who report engaging in bullying report higher substance use. In particular, we find higher rates of drug use and alcohol use. More physical fights that they're experiencing both as the aggressor as well often as a victim. Higher rates of dropout. And later on, higher criminal record rates and more traffic citations even. We also see a pattern whereby individuals who are engaged in bullying while they're in school are often involved in partner in a domestic abuse situations later in life. Interestingly, even bystanders to bullying, so those who witness it but aren't directly involved, report negative outcomes. So individuals who observe bullying report higher substance use, greater levels of depression, greater levels of anxiety, and higher school absences. So the entire school community is impacted here. When we think of bullying, we often think of traditional bullying, which we could call interpersonal bullying. So this is based on personal characteristics, like someone being shy or maybe withdrawn. However, increasingly we see intergroup bullying, which is also called bias-based bullying. This is bullying that's due to someone's group membership. So for instance, their race, their gender, their disability identity, etc. Intergroup bullying or bias-based bullying is often rooted in bias or prejudice, and it has equally problematic outcomes. So we can think about what some of these outcomes are, but I want to show you some of the data that we have from our group that documents some of the problematic outcomes for bias-based bullying in particular. So first, we want to know, do those who experience bias-based bullying report similar outcomes to those who experience generalized or interpersonal bullying? To answer this question, we did a study looking at some secondary data analysis. So each year, the National Crime Victimization Survey has what's called a school crime supplement. What they do with this data collection is collect a nationally representative sample. They survey families going into the home to do the survey. And it's been ongoing since 1973. So it's a long running measure, though it does get kind of updated and adapted depending on the context of the moment. The school crime supplement samples all youth between 12 and 18 years of age who are in the selected households that take part in the study. And in the 2015 sample, which is what we used for this analysis, there were about 9,000 or so youth represented altogether. Now, out of that 9,000 youth, only a small group reported experiencing bullying. So we focused our analyses on those youth who did identify that they had experienced bullying in the last year. So this was about 700 12 to 18-year-olds. And the sample was fairly reflective of the primary sample for the school crime supplement. So it was slightly more female representation than male representation. And it was pretty reflective of the demographics of the US at the time. So about 78% European American and then kind of a mix across other ethnic groups. Remember, they were aiming for a nationally representative sample, so this was pretty good in terms of ethnically representative at the time for 2015. So in this survey, they asked the youth who did report bullying to answer a couple of questions. They first asked them to attribute why they were bullied. So when you were bullied in school this year, did you ever think it was related to? And then they had a series of categories that they could select from: race, religion, ethnicity, gender, disability, and sexual orientation. They also asked kids to report if they didn't think that it was attributed to any of those reasons. So that group we call the Generalized Bullying group. And there were about close to 500 of the kids in the sample who said, I am bullied, but it's not because of any of these identity characteristics. Then we also grouped those who reported bias-based bullying, but only selected one of those categories. So they, for instance, said, I'm bullied because of my gender, or I'm bullied because of my religion, but indicated that it was just one dimension of their identity that they were experiencing bullying as a result of. Then finally, there was a smaller group that reported being bullied because of two or more dimensions of their social identity. Now, these two groups that reported bias-based bullying looked a little bit different. So those who reported bullying based on a single identity were pretty spread out in terms of those identity characteristics that they felt were the reason why they were targeted, with about a quarter reporting that it was because of their gender, close to a quarter reporting it was because of a disability they had, a quarter-ish reporting it was due to race, and then smaller numbers for some of those other categories. Those who selected that they were bullied for more than one identity category looked a little different. They were often reporting bullying because of race or ethnicity, and then we see sort of an even split across the other categories of gender, sexual orientation, disability, and religion. But what's important here is that sometimes kids attribute the bullying that they're receiving to more than one dimension of their identity. And we were interested in how do these kids compare in terms of outcomes? So do those who experience generalized bullying look similar or different than those who experience bias-based bullying on one dimension of their identity or on more than one dimension of their identity? In terms of outcomes, we focused on a few different types of responses that kids could provide. So we looked at general negative outcomes of bullying. This captured psychological, physical, and academic outcomes. As an example, they were asked, did the bullying have a negative effect on how you feel about yourself? We also looked at fear at school, and we found that they measured fear in school on the way to school and also at other times. We collapsed this together. An example item was, how often are you afraid that someone will attack or harm you when you're in the school building? So what we found is that all of these kids who reported bullying reported negative outcomes, however, and fear at school. However, we saw an increase in the negative reports as we moved from the group that reported generalized bullying to those that reported single identity bias-based bullying and those that reported multiple identity bias-based bullying. So if you were targeted because of a dimension of your identity, outcomes were looking worse than if you were experiencing generalized bullying. So just to sum that up, the findings suggest that we really do need to pay attention to bias-based bullying because the kids who report bias-based bullying were reporting more negative outcomes and greater fear at school than those who reported generalized bullying. And those who felt targeted for more than one dimension of their identity reported the most negative outcomes and the most fear. So that leads us to ask, how can we help? In the work in our lab, we've been especially focused on what's called bystander responses. So we talked about those witnesses a little bit earlier. There are often individuals who observe bullying happening. We know that the outcomes for them are often problematic as well, but they have opportunities to respond and hopefully to intervene to help stop that bullying. So if you're thinking about bullying that's happening at a school, we automatically consider the victim and the bully, but we also have individuals who are supporters of that bully, who might be cheering them on or encouraging that bully in some way. We also have kids who are actively defending that victim and saying this isn't okay. They may take different approaches to their defending behavior. So they may seek out help from a teacher, or they may go directly and help the victim. We also have kids who are not involved, who observe it, but stay out of the situation altogether. And in our work, we've been interested in how we move kids from being supporters or not involved to actually wanting to help and actively intervene. Right now, it looks like only about 25% of the time do peers actively intervene. And we know that when a school has kids who are more likely to actively intervene, they tend to have lower rates of bullying, and bullying tends to stop much more quickly if somebody does intervene. So broadly, a lot of the work in our lab recently has been focused on trying to figure out how do we help kids want to be and feel confident in being interveners, ones who will stand up and try to stop bullying from happening. So to start thinking about this, we began with kind of subtle instances of bullying. We started with subtle instances of bullying because they are pervasive. So often discriminatory or bullying behaviors can be indirect. For instance, we see microaggressions occurring at very high rates in schools recently. Microaggressions are subtle statements or behaviors that can communicate harmful messages about your group. Race-based humor is an example of a microaggression. So an individual might hear humor that targets their racial group and that communicates discriminatory messages about their racial and ethnic group. And we know from previous data that race-based humor occurs quite frequently in school environments. We were interested in whether kids would actually stop and intervene if they heard subtle race-based humor occurring. Now, we might think that this isn't particularly problematic, it's just jokes, but previous data shows that experiencing race-based humor does have negative impacts for kids, particularly in terms of things like stress and anxiety. Moreover, at a more kind of stark level, the Charleston shooter, Dylan Roof, who went into a church and murdered 9 people, when his peers from high school were interviewed about their experiences with him, they often reported that he made a lot of racist jokes while he was in school. Specifically, one of his classmates said that he didn't seem dangerous, but he would talk about Southern pride. And his classmate said it was just jokes. He would make racist jokes. So for us, this really highlighted the fact that we need to focus on all types of bullying, even these more subtle types that might not appear that they could have negative consequences. We want kids to feel compelled and able to intervene in microaggressions as well as in more explicit forms of bullying like fighting. So in this study, we asked kids to evaluate whether they would intervene if they observed race-based humor. This study was collected in the southeastern, this data was collected in the southeastern United States, and we were focused on 8th graders and 10th graders for this study. We had about 250 kiddos, primarily European American in this sample, low to middle income, collected from public schools. We asked kids to make these evaluations about how they would respond if they observed race-based humor, and we categorized their bystander responses or potential bystander responses into a couple of categories. First, we looked at whether they would implicitly support that bully. That would be things like not get involved and stay with the group. So you're not explicitly encouraging that bully to continue, but you're also not trying to help that victim. We looked at explicit supports. So for instance, joining in with the joke, or we also looked at types of challenging behavior. So implicitly challenging would be things like going to get a teacher, a family member, or another adult, or telling them later. So you're not directly confronting that bully, but you're doing something that will help to protect the victim and stop the bullying from happening. Getting help from a friend as well is another option for an implicit challenge. Finally, we also looked at explicit challenges. So those are the things like, I'm not going to be involved in this. I'm going to walk away and say that this is not okay. I'm also going to talk to the joker about it afterwards and say, your behavior is not okay. This needs to stop. What we found was that in general, our 8th grade participants were more likely to want to challenge this aggressive behavior than were 10th grade students. So this is kind of interesting. We often think about bullying as occurring sort of in similar ways across different school years, but this suggests that we might need to put a particular focus on high school students, that they might not feel as able or as compelled to challenge the group. When we dug into the reasoning, so when kids told us why they thought they would engage in a challenging behavior or not engage in a behavior to challenge that bullying, we found that group loyalty was referenced more. So they wanted to stay loyal to their friends. They didn't want others to think that they weren't a part of the group any longer. And explicitly, this suggests that we might need to do more work focusing on high schools and intervention programs, and think about encouraging kids to challenge their group if they're engaging in behavior that's not acceptable. Students also expressed concerns about being excluded or targeted themselves if they spoke up, which again suggests that maybe we need to work to give kids tools to think about options that they could have for intervening as bystanders. So you may not need to directly confront the bully in that moment because you may be concerned that you're going to be targeted yourself, but getting help, supporting that victim later, confronting the bully after the situation could all be approaches that might not lead you to feel like you're going to be victimized yourself right then and there, but you can still help that victim. So in general, this leads us to ask the question, do kids in your school or community stand up to prejudice and bullying? And then if they do, how can we help encourage them to do this more? So what are the strategies that we can use to really encourage kids to stand up and challenge? I know that I think let's hold the question and get folks to talk about it after I finish up. But I know that you guys are probably seeing many strategies in your school buildings that are working really well as may have questions about how you can encourage kids to stand up and challenge bullying if they are seeing it happen and not currently stepping in. So I'm going to present a little bit of data on another project that we recently did that focuses on bullying of immigrants. So increasingly, kids are reporting that they are being targeted for bullying if they come from an immigrant background. So this is just a little bit of recent news that highlights this as an issue that is increasing. At the moment, the most recent data indicates that students, about 23% of students are reporting being bullied a few times a month on average. However, immigrants, refugees, and other minoritized individuals are the group that are the most vulnerable to bullying, and much of that bullying is directly rooted in prejudice and discrimination. In the US right now, about 25% of kids in the public school system have an immigration background. And again, I have to note that this data is about 10 years old, and I think it has increased since then, but I couldn't find really reliable stats that indicated where we are right now in terms of percent of immigrant children in schools. I expect it's even higher. So this is a group that might be particularly vulnerable that we were interested in understanding their experiences. We were thinking about what factors might matter if someone is going to intervene to help someone who is being victimized because of their status as an immigrant to the United States. We know that prejudice are generally defined as rigid and irrational generalizations about a group or a category of people. We also know that bias is a belief, an attitude, or a practice, behavior or practice that reflects an assumed superiority of one group over another. And discrimination is that treatment, so treating someone differently based on prejudice feelings or biased beliefs. And we thought that generally, these are often rooted in assumptions about group identity and group membership, so they might be particularly important when we think about whether someone does intervene in a situation where they're observing someone being targeted because of their identity as an immigrant. There's a little bit of prior data that suggests this might be the case. So individuals with prejudicial attitudes and discriminatory behavior towards immigrants are more likely to see bullying towards that immigrant group as okay. But this data was collected outside of the US, and our context is a little bit different here. So we wanted to still focus on discrimination as a potential factor that might matter when someone's deciding whether to intervene or not. We also thought that what group you belong to might matter. So for instance, we know that in-group and out-group distinctions emerge very early on. We saw in the study on race-based humor that kids were thinking about staying loyal to their friendship group when they were making decisions about whether to intervene or not. And we know that in-group and out-group distinctions can really quickly lead to us versus them thinking. So generally, we want to help our in-group. And we know that kids hold less negative attitudes towards an in-group peer who's aggressive towards someone from another group. So if you are thinking of a potential group membership that you have as being a national identity, and you think of immigrant peers as not holding that national identity, you may be more likely to think that bullying that targets them is acceptable and less likely to intervene to help immigrant peers. We also know that kids are more likely to help someone when that victim is an in-group member generally. This prior data didn't look at immigration context in particular, so we weren't sure how immigration identity might matter, but we expected that the group that you belong to may factor into whether you decide to intervene or not. Related to that, we thought that intergroup contact would matter. So some kids have more opportunity to interact with people who are different than them than others. We know that intergroup contact suggests that we should provide rich opportunities for kids who are different to interact. And we know that there are a couple of conditions that are especially important for helping this to be successful. So making sure that there's equal status between the groups, making sure that the authority figures in the building, so the teachers and parents and school personnel, are supportive of this intergroup contact. Giving the kids opportunities to have common goals. So shared activities, collaborative activities are really helpful in this domain. And then encouraging them to cooperate together to achieve these goals. We know that kids who have more opportunity for intergroup contact are less likely to exclude others. So we have a pretty good sense that intergroup contact might matter, but again, it hadn't been looked at yet with immigrant bullying. We also know that more intergroup contact is linked to pro-social behavior intention. So you want to help more if you have experienced more opportunities to have interactions that are positive and meet these contact conditions with peers from the other group. So in this study, we looked at 6th graders and 9th graders. The data was collected in a rural school district, public schools. And in this particular community, there were a high number of youth who had at least one parent who was born outside of the US. So we considered those to be our immigrant origin youth. Often those kids were actually born in the US themselves, but one of their parents was not born in the US. It's a pretty ethnically diverse sample reflective of the community. And again, we had about 44% who did identify that one of their parents at least was not born in the US. So in this study, we were also thinking about different types of bullying that kids might experience. So we gave them a scenario where they evaluated bias-based bullying. So let's imagine that a student from another country lives in the US, her peers shout rude words at her and no one stands up for her and she doesn't know what to do about it. We asked them to assess a couple of different questions. So for instance, how okay or not okay is that? And then also to think about how likely they would be to intervene in a few different ways, like saying something to your classmates or getting help from a teacher. In addition to assessing bias-based bullying, we also assessed interpersonal bullying. So what if it's a peer from the US who is experiencing this bullying because she's shy and quiet? And then just to make sure that it wasn't the difference between being shy and quiet and being an immigrant, we also did a situation that was interpersonal bullying targeting an immigrant. So someone who is an immigrant to the US, but is targeted because she is shy and quiet, not because of her identity as an immigrant. So we asked kids to provide responses to a few different measures so that we could test out some of these factors. So we had them do a task that assesses discriminatory tendencies. This is kind of a neat task. It's pretty subtle, but it works really well. You ask kids to identify where someone who's new to your neighborhood who is an immigrant should live. And we show them their house and then they select where they would have that person live on their street. Higher discriminatory tendencies are associated with selecting a house that's further from your own house. We asked them about intergroup contacts. So how often do you get the opportunity to do school projects or study with students who are from a different country but now live in the United States? And broadly, what we found first was that there are differences based on the type of bullying that we experienced, that we had them evaluate, So in general, we see that our immigrant peers were more likely to want to step in to help other immigrants who were being targeted. And we find that that pattern becomes more stark with age. So as we look at the 6th graders in comparison to the 9th graders, we see that the 9th graders are generally a little bit less likely to seek help, but mostly they're less likely to seek help if they're non-immigrant peers and an immigrant is being targeted. So in that situation where it was bias-based bullying targeting the immigrant, as well as when it was generalized bullying targeting the immigrant, we see with 9th graders especially, that there's a little bit of a dip in their willingness to help. In general, though, these numbers are pretty decent. So we're hovering at about the midpoint here, a little bit over for a lot of these responses. So kids are interested in wanting to help. So what predicts them wanting to help? We found they were more likely to say that the bullying was okay if their family didn't have an immigration background or if they reported discriminatory tendencies. And we found that they were more likely to want to help if their family did have an immigrant background, if they had more intergroup contact with immigrant peers, regardless of their family's background. And we also found that social cognitive skills mattered. So kids who were better at perspective taking recognized bullying as more wrong and wanted to help. So this is a really interesting finding in terms of potential intervention, because it suggests that we need to be encouraging kids to think about the perspective of the victim, as well probably as the perspective of the bully, when they're thinking about how they might respond if someone is being targeted. Okay, next I'm going to think with you all, just a little bit about how messages are communicated to kids. So if we think about the fact that perspective taking matters, where are kids getting the sources of information that they use to determine how they might respond and how they could respond? Messages about bullying come from everywhere. So kids are constantly engaging in observational learning. Those of you who are on the call who are teachers, I'm sure see this daily with your students. And we know that they're sorting through the messages that they get from many different sources and trying to prioritize how to evaluate this information, what's trustworthy, and what might be important as they make their next decisions. So they receive messages from parents, from teachers, from their peers, from siblings, from the media, and probably from lots of other sources that I don't have listed here as well. And all of those messages may not communicate the same information. So in some of our work, we were especially interested in what messages they get from teachers and schools and how those messages might help them to think about how they could respond. So we know that schools should be a safe and welcoming space for all students. We know kids want schools and expect schools to be inclusive. So they judge exclusion that happens at school to be more wrong than exclusion that happens out of school. There's a standard that kids hold that their school should be a place where others are welcomed. We also know that if you feel like you belong and you fit in at your school, you feel connected to your school, then we see better academic outcomes and we see better school success outcomes. So overall, kids are doing better if we have higher rates of belonging and school connectedness. We also know that teachers can play an important role in shaping inclusive practices that might discourage bullying. So for instance, when teachers set inclusive school norms and establish explicitly with kids that they want the school to be a place where everyone feels welcomed and like they belong, then children tend to experience less exclusion and less bullying. We also know that school climate can matter quite a lot. So perceptions of school climate, school climate involves perceptions of the school environment, including things like student-teacher relationships, how positive you think those are, differential treatment of students. So do you think that some students always get all the opportunities in the school building? School connectedness. So again, coming back to those feelings of belonging. We also thought that school climate is probably going to foster bystander intervention because we know generally that more positive climate in general bullying is associated with greater intentions to intervene. And we know that students are more likely to include victims if they report better student-teacher relationships. So after someone's been victimized, you're more likely to be welcoming to them later if you have a better relationship with your teacher. So in this study, we wanted to look kind of comprehensively at these school factors and teacher factors that might matter to see if we could identify some places where teachers and schools could really work to encourage bystander intervention and help prevent bullying from happening in the first place. This was a large study with 6th graders and 9th graders. It was fairly representative in terms of ethnicity, and it was conducted in the southeastern United States. So generally, we found that our female participants and those who reported better student-teacher relationships were more likely to say that bullying was wrong. We also found that our ethnic minority participants, those who were anxious about being rejected by their teachers, and those who reported more discrimination from their teachers were less likely to judge bullying as wrong. We think that this probably has to do with experiencing bullying, that these groups probably have experienced some amount of bullying or some negative interactions in their school environment, and maybe thinking about retaliation as a potential way to respond. We're especially concerned about when victims seek out opportunities to retaliate and begin to justify retaliation as a good next step, because we know that it can escalate and lead to extreme instances of violence like school shootings. So next, we wanted to know whether kids would intervene and what predicted that. We found that kids reported that they would be more likely to step in to help the victim if they thought that bullying was wrong, and if they had positive student-teacher relationships. So those are definitely helpful. We also found that if they perceived their school more generally to have a positive social environment, then they were more likely to step in and help victims. They wanted to continue that positive social environment. We found they were less likely to help if they felt that their teacher treated them unfairly or if they were worried about being rejected by their teacher. We think that this is probably rooted in concerns about having the teacher assume that they were involved in the bullying in the first place. And we do often have kids tell us that they are concerned about stepping in and intervening when bullying happens because they don't want anyone to assume that they were involved in the situation and that they were the bully as well. Often bullying situations are chaotic and escalate quickly, and these concerns about how others will perceive your role are often very pressing for kids. They're worried about this. So based on this data, what do we think we can do to help foster positive environments? We think building school community matters. We want kids to see their similarities. So if you look to others in the room, and even if you don't share the same race or ethnicity, or you don't share the same gender identity, if you see yourselves as part of the larger school community, or you see yourselves as both kids who like English or both kids who are really interested in math, then those similarities can help you to want to help each other and support each other. This comes back to that note that I made at the very beginning of the presentation, where I said that one thing that I observed when I was teaching at Durham School of the Arts was that those identity memberships around arts affiliation really did supersede a lot of these intergroup categories that might normally divide kids. So we tended to see kids sitting at lunch with others who shared their arts affiliation, even though in a traditional lunchroom you might see kids sitting based on race or ethnicity, for instance. So helping kids see their similarity, helping them identify common in-group categories that they share can be really helpful. Also, explicitly encouraging kids to speak up when they see something. Often kids don't intervene because they don't know that they should intervene, or they don't know how to intervene. So giving them support for speaking up, explicitly telling kids, if you see someone being victimized and you intervene, you are not going to be held responsible. We're not going to think that you were the bully here. We want you to step in and help that victim, and we want you to get adult help to help that victim. So come and tell us what you see. So we may need to do some explicit direct instruction around this. So teaching kids how to tell someone if bullying is happening can be really helpful. That could be having a system for reporting. Even an anonymous system is often really helpful, because that removes some of that fear that kids might have about how you speak up and tell someone that bullying is happening, if you're worried that that bully is going to come after you if they hear that you reported that bullying. So give them a system, give them some strategies, have them practice what it would be like to speak up and stand up to intervene if someone is being bullied. The more opportunities for practice, the better the systems of support in place, the more likely they're going to feel okay doing it when one of those situations happens and they need to step in and intervene. We also want to generally encourage kids to help each other and give them opportunities to help each other in the classroom. So that could look really different depending on the ages of students that you have, but encouraging pro-social behavior amongst kids is always going to be beneficial for helping to create positive social environments where they don't feel the need to engage in bullying in the first place. We also want to encourage schools to give kids opportunities to work with peers who are different than them. So that could be thinking about working with peers who are different than you in terms of gender, in terms of race or ethnicity, in terms of disability status, in terms of religion. The more opportunities you have for that positive intergroup contact, working with people who are different than you, the more likely you are to see them as potential friends and certainly peers who you want to support and help. So you could think about creating class assignments that encourage kids to get outside of their traditional friendship groups, and also encouraging after-school clubs to be more diverse in terms of who's included and who's represented in those groups. Finally, we could think about classroom diversity. So schools are increasingly trying heterogeneous school grouping and trying to get out of the traditional tracked classroom systems, which often do perpetuate basically school within school systems, where you end up with kids of one racial and ethnic group occupying one group of classes and kids of a different racial and ethnic group occupying another group of classes. Many school districts are trying now heterogeneous grouping, where, for instance, honors and standard level kids are in the same classroom together and may have differentiated assignments. We find that that's really helpful, both in terms of encouraging kids to try challenging classes when they may not have felt confident doing so before, but also in terms of giving kids the opportunities to work together and to cross those racial lines that are often perpetuated by traditional tracking systems. So creating diverse classes. Also for kids with disabilities, creating as many opportunities as possible to have those kids included in the traditional classroom and not just in special needs classrooms is really helpful for helping kids to begin to build those friendships across those traditional lines. In terms of school level change, it's important to bring back to your schools what you learned. So it's always a good idea to look at your data. So if you don't know yet how much bullying is happening in your school and why kids think they're being bullied, ask your administrators, your colleagues, and your peers to develop some approaches for collecting data, and then to actually look at it together and see what's going on. Knowing when bullying is happening in terms of what spaces it's happening, what times of day, who's being targeted, and why they think they're being targeted can really help you get some strategies in place for addressing that bullying. So think about who's being left out, who's being bullied, who is bullying, and why they might be engaging in those behaviors. Often there is something underlying happening that you can do some work to address. It could be an area of the building that's not being monitored closely enough. It could be a group of students who are feeling marginalized. It could be you've got some kids who were victims earlier and now are lashing back out and engaging in bullying behavior, who need some support around how to respond when they experience bullying without retaliating against those who are bullying them. It's important at the school-wide level to think about school-wide strategies to ensure fair and equitable treatment of students. While your own classroom is a wonderful place to start, and I think that's my next bullet point, start small with your own classroom. We want consistency so that kids feel that what's supported and implemented in one classroom is also supported and implemented school-wide. So the more opportunities we can have to have consistent messaging around what types of behaviors are acceptable, around how we're going to treat each other, and around how to ensure that we can get along with each other, even if we don't come from the same background. Those consistent messages across the whole school building are going to be the most effective in helping to change those school level norms to support inclusion and welcoming practices. It's also important to document impact. So reward the kids when you see them doing good things, encourage them to engage in fair and equitable treatment, and then note it when it happens. So giving positive feedback to kids and documenting what changes you're seeing in your building are going to be really helpful. Working with parents and community members as well around this. I have a slide coming up on that in just a few minutes, but don't think of it as just happening within the school building. We need this to happen more broadly. Finally, peer mediation and social emotional learning models can be incredibly helpful. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to dig completely into those today, but I would encourage your school to think creatively about adjusting your curriculum to make sure that you have social emotional learning built in if you're not already, and then to think about the disciplinary procedures in the school to consider possibly implementing some peer mediation or restorative justice strategies. We do know that that perspective taking was really important for kids, and the more opportunities you have to talk with your peers and to interact with your peers about why bullying is happening and why someone may have engaged in a particular behavior, the more opportunity you have to build those perspective taking abilities. My last bullet point I could not quite see because the black bar was hiding it, but that one is just looking for evidence-based approaches as you're engaging in the work to adopt restorative justice practices or social emotional learning. Make sure that there's some data behind it. I know sometimes the data comes later after you begin the implementation, but looking for evidence-based practices can help you ensure that you're making a decision that's rooted in science when you're thinking about these policies and practices. Okay, next we can think about how we go about doing the work for actually helping at the child level. We would say first, creating opportunities for intergroup contact is going to be really helpful. So we talked about those contact conditions earlier, but that's kind of vague. What does it look like in practice? So equal status. We want to make sure that kids feel like all groups in the building can excel, that every student has high expectations set for them. Thinking about creating cooperative situations. We want kids to be able to work together, for instance, in multiracial groups or in mixed gender groups. We want kids to have common goals. So helping to create assignments where everyone has expertise to contribute and where everyone is a key member of that team. So making sure that each member has an assigned role, each member of a group or a project, and making sure that they each feel as though they can bring some expertise to that project. Finally, sanctioning by authority figures. So making sure that teachers are on board for intergroup contact and that students feel like teachers support them in their efforts to get to know people who may be different than them. Here's a couple specific strategies that we can think about for different levels of schools. So at the elementary level, we can think about buddy systems, so pairing kids who have different backgrounds up together to build friendships, and using centers and group work to encourage diverse friendships. So mixing up who goes to centers at the same time, not always making it just a selection that the kids make on their own. At the middle school level, breaking up structural divisions can be really helpful. So I know that a lot of schools right now are limited in terms of how they can allow kids to move flexibly at lunchtime and have cohorts or groups that are sitting together at lunch. But when we get back to a little bit more normal structures, doing things like Mix It Up Day, where you encourage kids once a week to sit with someone who they don't know, and mix up those structural divisions that often occur in the lunchroom. And then again, coming back to that idea that we really do want to encourage kids to think about common in-group identities. That could be your school affiliation. It could be an interest, like we're both into Minecraft, or it could be an artistic talent or a skill that they have that they share in common. At the high school level, we want to make sure that we're looking to ensure diversity in clubs, teams, and school governance, so things like student council. And then I would encourage us to think about heterogeneous grouping. Consider trying to stop homogeneous grouping to ensure diverse classrooms within the school. So you want to try to aim to have kids from different backgrounds and different levels in the same building, in the same classroom, working together. So strategies that you might think about in your own classroom. We know that classroom climate is critically important. We know that children who feel that their teachers care about them are more motivated to do well in school. And inclusive classrooms can promote learning and well-being beyond just thinking about bullying situations. So take the time to discuss difficult issues with your students. Take the time to encourage them to speak up and stand up if they see someone being victimized. And don't shy away from addressing bias when it occurs. So sometimes those conversations can be very difficult, but asking kids to think carefully through why bias is happening and how we can get it out of our classroom, our school, or our community, giving them the agency to participate in those conversations can be really empowering for them. And you often find that they're thinking quite reflectively about why structural inequality occurs and why bias might be leaking into some of the settings in schools. I also want to note that families matter too. Most of the focus of the data that I gave you here today was on students themselves as well as teachers and schools. But we do know that bystander intervention is linked to strong attachment to parents. So kids who have stronger secure attachment to their parents are more likely to intervene. Kids who feel like their family is more supportive of them are more likely to intervene. So again, that might come back to not having to worry about if you're going to be perceived as the bully if you do step in and intervene. And we also know that kids who report higher levels of empathy are more likely to intervene, and that parental support can help to encourage and foster the development of empathy. We find that kids whose parents have more positive intergroup attitudes are less likely to engage in bias-based bullying and more likely to want to help victims when they see someone being victimized because of some element of their identity. So encouraging parents to share positive intergroup attitudes, share concerns with discrimination and bias when it occurs, can really help kids to see how they might stand up against bullying, bias, and discrimination when they see it occur. So ideally, we want schools and parents working together. So making sure that parents know what policies are in place in the school, helping parents to have the tools to reinforce to their children. If you see something happening, this is how you can help in your school. This is what's set up in your school to allow you to intervene, to allow you to report bullying when it happens. All right, I feel like I talked a lot. I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of the data that we have and what I would encourage as practices going forward. And then I also just wanted to thank my funders. So most of the research that I presented today was funded by either the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Justice. And schools, communities, and families, and my whole team of students.
Kelly, it was all great. I mean, it's here we are, we're 2 hours into this and my brain is full already. So it was I had a couple of insights. I mean, when you started talking about group loyalty, if you want to unshare your screen.
Yes, absolutely.
That's fine. You're talking about how 8th graders would get more involved than 10th graders. And I was thinking about even what Glenn was talking about was almost that status level.
Yeah.
Does that have a big role in that to play, that they haven't achieved a status, so they're more fearless in that way?
Yes, absolutely. We find that status matters in a couple of different ways. So we have documented that kids who are more popular in the school often feel like they've got the status and maybe they don't need to help others. We also find that kids who have previously experienced bullying, sometimes they want to help others and they don't want anyone else to go through that, but they can also feel disempowered if they speak up and intervene. That marginalized status that they already have can just be perpetuated. So they hang back and don't want to intervene. And you're absolutely right that over time, as you've established yourself in the school, you're a 10th grader now, and you feel like you've got it all figured out, you may feel like, I don't need to shake the boat. Things are going okay for me. I don't want to get involved here. Those transition years, like 6th grade and 9th grade, is often where we place our focus, because everything is reorienting then as kids are coming to a new building.
And they don't want to tarnish their status either.
Yep, absolutely.
By getting involved in things. And I think one of the other things too is thank you for pointing out, collect the data. And it is at your own school is one of the first things when I ever got involved in this. I was amazed that nobody was paying any attention and wanted to collect any data of their own school bullying, because they were so afraid it was going to make them look bad, but you wouldn't have any tools to move forward.
Absolutely.
So thank you for
I think as well, collecting data from as many informants as you can. So it is the case that often school personnel don't see the bullying when it happens, and that's intentional. The kids don't want you to see it. So you've got to make sure that you're not just looking at what ends up with an office referral, but you're also looking at what kids can tell you is happening that you might not see.
Our students are moles everywhere. They see and know everything happening in the school. So I've always been a big advocate of talking and getting info directly from them. So we have a lot of questions. So I'm going to dive into this. Paul from Cincinnati and actually Amy from Farmington Hills have a very similar question. They're seeing a rise in religion-based bullying, particularly towards their Jewish students, but also Asian American students. So one, how can we offer support to those students, even if we don't share the characteristics? And then what are some resources that they can use to address those issues?
Absolutely. So they're kind of the older school thinking about how to respond when someone is being bullied is to try to fix that person. So to try to figure out, is there a social skill deficit here that we need to work on with that victim to help them be better prepared? And especially in instances of bias-based bullying, that is just not going to work, because it's a dimension of your identity. So we want to affirm that identity for those students and let them know that even though someone's targeting you because of your religion or because of your race, that does not diminish who you are as a person, and you need to have pride in that identity that you have. So I would say that we want to support them by providing those social emotional outlets and encouraging school-wide having social emotional learning curricula in place, especially evidence-based ones, but then also to make sure that we're doing the work to address the bullies, even more so than the victims, because we want to make sure that we aren't making victims feel as though they did something to cause this bullying. They can't change their identity. They shouldn't change their identity. So affirming those identities for them can be really helpful.
Yeah. In any situation, we always have the bully, the target, and the bystanders. So what Cindy wants to know about, what is the effect possibly on the bystanders? When someone is being targeted by racist jokes or teasing comments, what's the effect? I mean, you talked a little bit about that and how they see it. What's that effect on bystanders?
Yeah, so what's interesting is right now, the data that we know about bystanders is from generalized bullying. So we know that those bystanders, those who witness bullying, are going to report these more negative experiences like greater anxiety and stuff like that. But there's not a lot of data out there yet on if you see someone targeting a group that you're part of, but you're not being directly targeted, that has got to have negative consequences in terms of psychological well-being and mental health. But right now, the data hasn't dug that deeply into that. So I think it's an area for future research to really explore if you're witnessing others being bullied for a category that you also share, or maybe even just being bullied because of other dimensions of their identity. How does that impact you directly? Definitely, I think we need more work in that area.
Yeah. And that's always good. So somebody out there listening, if you want to do work in that, and that's what the conversation is all about. We find out things that we're missing pieces of the equation. Somebody else out there is already kind of working on it. So that's always a good thing to do. So David in Sandusky is asking about making connections with an overwhelmingly homogeneous population. They're all similar backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds. So how is it to talk with them about people who are or appear to be different from that society?
That's a really great question, because even if you're in a homogenous community right now, you're probably not going to be in a homogenous community your whole life. And so we want to prepare kids for entering that global world, even if their community at the moment is more narrow. The data on Intergroup Contact actually shows that intergroup contact can be really effective, even if you're not face-to-face and in direct contact with another group. So there are a couple of strategies that have been really useful. Imagined contact. So for instance, having kids do work to imagine what it would be like to be friends with someone who's different than them has documented high rates of effectiveness, as well as what's called extended contact. So hearing about friends of yours or others like you who are friends with people who are different. Teachers have been using frequently strategies like storybook reading. So encouraging kids to read about other stories where kids who are from different backgrounds are interacting together can be really helpful. So yeah, even if you don't have that opportunity for direct contact in the building, creating indirect, extended, or imagined contact opportunities can be helpful.
So now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So Betsy in Detroit, so what about the experience of one minority group towards another minority group in the same school? They both are experiencing bullying and other effects for each of the group, but how do you get them to kind of see the differences and how the other area is looking at it?
Absolutely. So I think conversations are really critical. So encouraging kids to do that restorative justice work. So talking through, what is your perspective? Why were you doing this? Why were you thinking about this? And then if they're not actually involved in the bullying, but it's happening around them, those classroom conversations around what do we have in common and how can we come together to think about our similarities and not necessarily our divisions can be helpful, as well as recognizing divisions when they occur. So recognizing the role of bullying, recognizing the role of discrimination, and explicitly giving kids the opportunity to grapple with those difficult topics can be helpful.
And also, and I totally agree. I mean, you just have to have that conversation, open it up. But sometimes I think maybe people think those are painful conversations.
Absolutely.
You know, and they don't want to have those conversations. And so maybe it's easier sometimes of letting the students, you know, maybe set those ground rules and let the students kind of bring those things up, because
I'm also a big proponent of giving them materials to think about. So like reading novels that involve bias or discrimination and giving them a platform to talk about it that's just slightly removed from their own classroom at first can be a helpful entryway, so that then they can begin to think about how does this apply in their own lives and their own situations as well.
Yeah. Through your studies and all your work, do you feel it, this is Lindsay in New Haven, and as a former teacher, do you have students who you feel like are receptive to learning about this? Or, you know, every time we seem to talk about bullying, we get the eye rolling, oh, here we go again. But it sounds like they are receptive to this and they do want to help.
I think they definitely want to help. They don't often have the tools to know how to help. And so I think when we engage in those bullying, anti-bullying campaigns and efforts, doing that explicit instruction on, first of all, intervening helps. Like, kids don't often think that it's going to help. They think, I'm just going to go tell a teacher and nothing's going to change. So letting them know that it can help, and then giving them explicit tools around how do you actually do this work. So getting away from just the abstract, don't bully, to if you see it happen, here's what you can do, can be really helpful.
Yeah. And I think part of that, we have to kind of push back. It's also the parents as well. As not my kid, which is the big thing, you know, we've all heard for years.
Yeah.
So, and my last question, I wrote a note down also when you were talking about immigrants, you know, that's a big issue. And how does politics kind of feed into this? Left or right, it's both sides.
Absolutely.
And how that trickles down to our students, and how we as adults have to be really aware. Is that something you'd be looking at?
Absolutely. So we know that media can have huge influences in the intergroup attitudes that kids have. So if they are exposed to media messaging, that either social media or even news media messaging that communicates messages of hate or discrimination, then they're absorbing that. They are observational learners from every bit of information that comes into them. And so making sure that they have access to messages from their families, from their communities, and from the media that they are exposed to, that is recognizing problems when they exist and working to challenge those problems can be really helpful. But you're absolutely right that they are little sponges soaking up everything that comes in their ears. And if those messages are negative, discriminatory, or hostile, that can lead directly to differences in how they behave and how they interact with others.
Yep. I was just going to ask and say, we call them little sponges for a reason. And
absolutely.
You beat me to it. So Dr. Kelly Lynn Mulvey, thank you so much for all of the information that you've given